Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that. I want to say thank you to Jeff for being here today with us, and also for Richard Wakeman from Microsoft for joining us for the session today. Really excited about the questions we're going to be able to get through today, and talking to Jeff about what's going on with CMMC, and then Richard is really going to bring a lot of flavor from the cloud standpoint, and I'm really looking forward to a good conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and I think we're just going to jump right in. So Jeff, before we get into cloud-specific topics, can you talk through a little bit about the announcement that Ellen Lord made this week regarding DISA's involvement? Sure. and how DISA is going to interact with the AB moving forward? And then I know you also have just been having some conversations about EMASS and that whole piece. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Sure, absolutely. So if you read social media, people think the AB is a single entity off doing all these things, and we do have a lot we're working on, but it really is an exercise of partnership. We have our great partners from Hopkins, from MITRE, from SEI, and now from DISA, and we're all working together to define what data needs to be collected and why and how and what the workflow is. And I actually was just on the phone this morning with them, some of those partners, talking about exactly what data items do we need to collect. And people need to think about the use of EMASS as a back-end storage, a database of record type of scenario. So there's been lots of talk on social media about it being an assessment tool and to be used in all different kinds of ways. And right now, the way we're looking at it is as a database of record for the back end. So the formal official record of the results of the assessment will, for the foreseeable future, be EMASS, and we're just in the beginning stages of working on that right now.
That's great. Yeah. So with EMASS, a lot of people are very familiar with using it from a DoD standpoint, but for contractors, it's going to be a little bit of a new thing for CMMC, right? Yeah. So do you see any? There are going to be challenges, obviously. What kind of challenges do you foresee with that kind of
Sure. Setup? Yeah. Obviously, there's a learning curve out there. There's data, load testing types of issues related to that. Because if you put whole thousands of people on a new system at any time, you have a lot of issues with that. There's still a lot of things under discussion about how it's going to be used. So I don't want to commit to any particular approach. Sure. But it's looking like that the use of the assessment database anyway will be primarily C3PAOs and assessors and the AB, not the 300,000 DIB members that might be have records in there, but maybe won't need to be working in there as much, at least from an assessment standpoint. So the volume of users may not be as large as you might think, because we're talking about maybe 400 or 500 C3PAOs and an AB presence. So, as far as EMASS is concerned, that's not a huge load. So there are going to be challenges, but maybe not as much as you might think.
So would a prime contractor, for example, be able to go to the system, to like EMASS, and be able to search if they're trying to put together a proposal and they want to search to all their subs to find out if they've been certified, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So we haven't designed that at this point, but there is going to need to be a facility to look up in some way. And so the question is how secure does that have to be, and who's allowed to see that information? Because our adversaries,
they want to get that information.
Could use that information, right? And we don't necessarily want to share that. And so the kind of data being captured and the information being captured right now is not being shared publicly, and may never be.
Right.
And I don't know. I'm not the person that decides that, but there will need to be some facility, at least for the federal government, to check on the maturity level ratings of various companies, but that still is under discussion and still being worked on.
Right. Yeah. You bring up a great point. There's since the beginning days of CMMC, even when Katie Arrington was talking about it in the early days, it was you're not going to put your CMMC certification level on your website, right? Because that just kind of tells the adversaries what you're not doing to be able to attack you. So
and more than that, the results of the assessment and assessment reports and so forth will need to be protected as CUI, and even in level 1, right? Which is just kind of an interesting scenario, because level 1 doesn't necessarily deal with CUI, or it doesn't by definition, but assessment reports, probably will be.
Yeah, they're pretty sensitive.
So that's going to be an interesting outcome.
Okay, great. So from a schedule standpoint, I mean, we're kind of right in the thick of it. It seems like, it feels like it's about to kick off. It's like Christmas Eve almost, right?
Yeah.
So kind of where are we from a schedule standpoint? What are we looking at next? What should we expect next? And, everybody's really looking forward to the training aspects. What should we expect to see from a training standpoint, both from training the trainers and then also training the C3PAOs and training the RPOs and all of that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah, on this meeting this morning, we were talking about AB years being like dog years. I mean, we started this in January, and it's amazing the amount of things that have been done since then. And we've put together training courses, we've put together a certification model, we're working on this EMASS database with our partners. Assessment guides. I mean, all kinds of stuff has happened in the last 6 months. And we were trying to remember, like somebody said, well, remember when we were talking about this, and when none of us could remember about, I can't remember what it was, but we said, oh, this is like dog years. It seems like it was years ago when we talked about this. So you're right, we're on the cusp now, and there's a lot of energy on social media about this. Like, when is this going to come out? And what's the AB up to? What are they doing? Well, we have our first training class scheduled for August 31st. And the first class is going to be what we're calling provisional assessors.
Right.
And a provisional assessor is someone who is authorized for a period of time to kind of be our pathfinders, to be our pilots, to be the people that are out there in the field trying it out for the first time, because there is a published assessment methodology, there's assessment guide being finished up and developed, there's a model. We need to get it out in the field and try it in the commercial market. We've been doing some pilots, some mock assessments with our partners being led by folks at Hopkins and the SCI. And now we want to get some provisional assessors out in the field to start doing some assessments. And so the provisional assessors are going to be trained in 3 classes. They'll be the last week of August, the last week of September, and the last week of October. We'll be doing about 30 to 40 students per class and getting them out there in the field and hopefully starting to do level 1, 2, and 3 assessments pretty quickly. Now these provisional assessors, there's going to be 72 of them right now is the count. And they're going to be mostly randomly selected from the list of applicants. And then the AB members, some of the AB members anyway, will be observing some of them to get started, kind of fly on the wall observation, to just get feedback in real time about what's happening on the ground and how the assessment's being conducted. So a lot of things are coming together all at once here. And I would say that within a month, a lot of the open questions you're seeing on social media are going to be answered, and people are going to be, oh, I guess they do have stuff going on over there. Right. So we'll see a lot of stuff pretty soon. Okay.
So with cloud providers, that's a whole different set of a constituency, if you will, right?
Sure,
I mean, you've got your OSCs that are out there looking to get certified. You've got your C3PAOs and then you've got your RPOs that are going to be doing consulting and those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
But with our cloud providers like Microsoft, what is going to be the requirement for them? I mean, Microsoft has already gone through it, and AWS and many others have gone through a lot of certification with FedRAMP and all these other things. What are they going to have to do in addition, to be CMMC?
Right. Well, so an OSC that uses, say a Microsoft Azure or AWS or something that has been validated as, whatever they're validated with, there's multiple ways to do that. But let's say they're FedRAMP High or something like that. As long as we can validate that, then an OSC is free to use their tools and their software to provide data storage and provide security for that data. And when we conduct assessments, we'll look at that, and there'll be either an on-prem score or an inherited score. In other words, that we know that Microsoft can provide this level of secure storage and the secure access, so that's what we call an inherited score. The OSC will need to validate with the assessor that is in fact, that they're using Azure and they're using the proper version and all that kind of good stuff. But they'll be able to inherit that score as part of the assessment. But use of a product like that will not give the OSC, free rein to say, oh, well, we don't need a CMMC assessment now.
Sure.
Because data storage is only part of and access is only part of the equation, right? There's physical on-prem things like access control, and there's configuration management, and there's metrics, and there's training, and there's processes and procedures. So it'll be kind of a mixed bag. There'll be some of the practices will be validated by verifying that the Microsoft product we know is a appropriate product, but there'll be others in the market that we're not as aware of, and they'll just have to be validated.
So Richard, kind of in response to that, what has Microsoft been doing in preparation for CMMC? What have you guys been doing to get ready so that you can, show OSCs and show other RPOs who are doing consulting that you guys are ready, willing, and able to support, from an infrastructure standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the analysis that we've done, especially a gap analysis of our existing accreditations that we'd have, for example, with a FedRAMP High or looking at the DISA SRG, that we've gone and compared that to the various different practices of CMMC all the way up to a level 3 thus far. And if you compare the Microsoft scope of responsibility to, for example, physical controls, et cetera, those are in alignment with what can be inherited by a tenant or a organization that is deploying workloads within our cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service, of course, has a bit heavier lift than you would see with, for example, software as a service that we have with Microsoft 365. So what we've done is establish a program of reciprocity so that you can be able to look at how the customer can inherit those controls, and along with that get a package of documentation, of course, that you can then be able to provide to the assessor so that you can prove, depending on which cloud that you're in, because we do have multiple that we'll talk about today, what level of inheritance that you get out of the box versus those that you can still look at being able to satisfy based on configuration, securing your environment, such as configuring conditional access controls, et cetera, that will close the gap even further. If you look at the requests that have come in from a lot of our customers already are saying, hey, we need to have an enumeration of all of the FIPS 140-2 certificates that you have in your data center. Of course, we do document those, for example, in our system security plan. We keep those up to date, but that's not something we believe that each one of our customers should have to go and solicit from Microsoft and put in their own system security plan. That should be something that Microsoft can provide to the assessor to get that level of inheritance. But then there, of course, there's a system boundary that you would have established that would be, what you have as part of the Microsoft platform. And using FIPS 140-2 as an example, naturally there's also customer requirements for that would go out to the customer networks and so forth. So it's a combination of the inherited controls with also what the customer would provide. Mm-hmm. We're looking to close that gap on both sides.
Great.
Okay.
So that's great.
So, kind of back to you, Jeff, we've got vendors like Microsoft and Amazon and others that have built these infrastructures, right? And they want to make sure that the OSC base, the 75 to 300,000 companies that are out there know that they have built these infrastructures that are compliant, right? I know there's been a lot of talk about a marketplace. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is the status of that right now?
Yeah, we're still working through the marketplace issue. I mean, it's an important piece of what the AB is doing, but our focus has really been in getting the provisional assessments and the training out. Mm-hmm. But there will be a marketplace, and the marketplace will not endorse any particular vendors or any particular providers, but it will give providers like Microsoft and Amazon and others an opportunity to be listed on the marketplace and give the OSCs and the RPs and the MSPs a place to go to see here's all of the potential software, hardware, service providers that are providing CMMC related services. So the marketplace will be up and running, before the end of the year, but it'll include system providers, it'll include RPs, RPOs, C3PAOs, and any other resources that an OSC might require to successfully go through the CMMC assessment process will be listed on the marketplace.
Okay, great. So to switch a little bit of a gear to something that Richard said, I wanted to play off of a little bit. He was talking about being able to provide an assessor the information that they have about their infrastructure. And as part of the assessment, instead of having to have the OSC have this information in their SSP, they can provide it as essentially inherited controls
Sure.
or inherited infrastructure to the assessor. What is being done, because I know you've been working on training, what is being done right now to train these assessors, I guess provisional assessors at this point,
Right, yeah.
in specifically in cloud technologies and how to assess cloud technologies
Sure.
versus on-prem technologies?
No, great question. Really great question. So you're probably familiar or heard about the assessment guides that are being developed, and the DoD is taking the lead on that, and the AB is providing support. And the focus has been on-prem, of course. That's how it started. But there is in the backlog and planned additions to the guide to include cloud examples. So if you think about what an assessment guide is, it takes the practice as written and translates it into different contexts. So, if there's a practice, and I'm not going to quote a practice, but take any given practice and say, in this environment, evidence of this practice would look like this. And in this environment, it would look like this, and in this environment, it would look like this. Well, the focus for the assessment guides initially is on-prem, but there is a backlog item to develop more examples, and those examples are going to include the cloud-based examples. But that is not in the assessment guides right now anyway, and they're under development. And so I would expect to see those later in the year.
Is there going to be a way, if you have a certain type of infrastructure, is there going to be a way to get an assessor that specializes in that type of infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question.
Because,
yeah.
If you build an infrastructure that's all cloud-based,
Yeah.
and you go get an assessor and they're like, well, I don't know anything about, AWS Gov Cloud or Microsoft Azure Gov, or, I don't know those infrastructures, Office
Sure.
365. How do they do that?
Yeah, I have this, I was talking to Regan about this last night, and I have the same problem in my own business. I don't have a CMMC business, but I have a model-based assessment business. And I was saying, I specialize in software. Like I work with software companies. But the models that my company works with also do hardware engineering and defense and missile technologies. And when I accept a contract, I don't accept a contract in that environment. So it's an open market system. So at this point, the AB is not planning on assigning assessors.
Okay.
What we're planning on is an open market system. And of course, early on in the process, there's going to be some control over who does what, because there's very few assessors, and the DoD has priorities that they would like us to work with, and that's exactly the right thing to do. But as the market grows and becomes more commonplace, and there's hundreds of thousands of DIB companies getting assessments, it's going to be open market. And so what I would recommend any OSC, once the system gets up and running in production, is to hire the right assessor. Interview the assessor, ask them questions about what they know and what they don't know, and you're allowed to hire the one that is the best suited for you. In my business, I do a lot of Agile assessments, and the first thing the client asks me is do you know what Agile is? And I say, oh yeah, and we have a great conversation about that, but there's people in my business that don't have that knowledge, and so don't hire them. Right. So it'll be an open market system, and I think that'll solve it.
Oh, that's great, because I know there's been a ton of questions about that specifically, and a lot of trepidation in the industry, right? Because these infrastructures are pretty intricate.
Yeah.
And every infrastructure is different.
Yeah, well, think about it. The same thing exists in small, medium, large, right? So if you have an assessor who is very steeped in, say, the infrastructure of companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and you send them to Bob's staffing company in Fairfax that has 15 employees, that assessor is going to come in and they're going to be like, okay, where's your infrastructure, and they're going to assess. I mean, this is just a human nature thing for assessors, and I've been in this business for 25 years. We assess against what we know and what we've experienced, and that's one reason I stay away from like missile defense, because I don't know anything about it. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I am an expert in software. So the assessors need to. We need a way for people to be able to choose their assessor, and that's exactly what we're going to do, or what we're planning on doing anyway.
That's great information. So kind of to play off of that, Richard, We've got companies that have hybrid infrastructures. We've got companies that got all on-prem, companies that have got cloud. What do you see as, the pros and cons of, the three different setups, cloud, hybrid, and on-prem when it comes to these kinds of security infrastructure, configurations?
Yeah. We've been very focused, I would say, in especially aligning the cloud requirements that we have for the defense industrial base around looking at how to do data protection for things like export controls with ITAR. Of course, meeting the regulations that would be from the Department of State and from the DoD, SRG, et cetera, in terms of how that would complement a hybrid configuration within our customer environment. So we've worked extensively, of course, with many of the Tier 1, Tier 2 DIB out there, and most of which, of course, have highly complex architectures with multi-cloud strategies that we need to be able to snap into and be able to provide, of course, a holistic solution across the Microsoft stack for security that can extend back into the on-premises solutions into a multi-cloud strategy. But the benefit would be better realized in many cases for scenarios where you have more of a cloud native solution. So if you look at especially small, medium-sized defense industrial based customers that can go 100% into, for example, the cloud, now you get to maximize the inheritance, of course, of the underlying platform and the investments that we've made into compliance and, of course, your security posture. In addition to, of course, being able to provide you with a suite of capabilities that you can adopt as part of your cloud native environment. Now, that's not exclusive to small and medium-sized businesses. We've also worked considerably with many of the Tier 1, the larger contractors, et cetera, because they need to set up enclaves, right, that would have a system boundary that would support programs of record or mission systems, et cetera, that would have a very similar profile where you've got the ability to have cloud-native capabilities, but also put more of a traditional perimeter around it, such as leveraging VDI with Windows Virtual Desktop to control data egress.
Right. Yeah, just from what we've seen in the industry, it seems like, larger companies, they're all going to be hybrid. They're either on-prem and looking at going to cloud, or they've got a large hybrid infrastructure, unless they're building an enclave, like you said. But as you get to that smaller, the smaller company size, things tend to move more and more cloud native and cloud only, right? Simply because the amount of service that you can get by going to a cloud infrastructure is so much greater than trying to build, all of these services on premises. It's just, financially not possible, for smaller companies to build all these capabilities on prem.
I think especially with small companies, you're going to see that happening more and more. But I guess I said this earlier, but I'll say it one more time. That's only part of the picture. So we need to make sure that our small companies that are watching realize that you just can't buy it as a cloud service. There's process and procedural components to the CMMC, as well as physical components.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the whole CMMC, it's about 70-80% of the controls are heavily technical, and then another 20% are mostly process and procedure based.
I think that's right.
And then you have all the maturity level processes in addition to that, right?
Yeah, and the maturity level component has not yet been absorbed by the general public.
No, it hasn't at all.
And it's something that I'm very passionate about because my business is maturity model assessments. So I'm very knowledgeable or passionate about that, I should say. But I don't think that the general public at large has really gotten their arms around what does this maturity mean. And I think once assessment happens, it's going to become clear very quickly what it means.
Right.
And all I can say about that is it's not enough to just do stuff. It needs to be part of your culture, and that's what maturity is about. It's about is security part of your culture or not? And if you have all your controls in place, but you have a back door that doesn't have a lock on it, and then everybody goes out there for smokes all the time, that's a maturity issue, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the market still has learning to do around what does the maturity part of cybersecurity maturity model mean, and that's going to become pretty apparent pretty quickly.
Yeah, and to expand, I tend to be one of the stakeholders within Microsoft representing the interests of CMMC across our enterprise. And one of the big questions I get both internally and externally is what's different about CMMC, and it is what you described. You know, historically, we would look at a system boundary being specifically an information system where you're protecting your controlled and classified information. You could take this paradigm even further to talk about even air gap clouds that we're releasing for classified workloads. Yeah. But if you look at the difference with this CMMC is how you take and extend that to your enterprise, right? And the maturity, even all the way down to the end user and the endpoint that you need to protect with them. So, there's a much larger set of considerations. It is the daily maturity that you would have from your end user perspective that needs to be secured processes.
I think the DoD has been careful, and appropriately so, in not overstating this and saying, now this isn't like a CMMI where you need to have this organizational construct to manage all your processes, because it's not a process model like CMMI or APH in the Agile world is. So they've been very careful, and appropriately so, to say, okay, maturity is very important to us. We're not saying, go overboard with it. We're saying, have training and have a plan and follow the plan and design resourcing and share information and have metrics and things like that. But they've been careful about that, and I think it's fair to say that they've baked in the appropriate amount of maturity controls for CMMC.
Great. Yeah. So, if you have a company that is looking at migrating, from on-prem into the cloud, what kind of challenges do you see your customers having? I'm going to talk to this a little bit as well, what I've seen, but you work with the big dib, right? You work with a lot of the tier one, primes. What kind of challenges are they having? Because those challenges are going to be different than the small medium businesses are having, right? So what do you see?
Well, historically, because of certain regulations, especially around meeting that higher watermark that you have for information protection of export controlled data, many of the companies have been really held hostage on premises in a lot of cases, right? Having a solution that you can move to and have the right level of comfort to move to the cloud, if you will, has been reserved, generally across the industry. As we, for example, at Microsoft have release clouds that are ITAR compliant and have capabilities with a complementary set of security controls and, of course, the entire security suite of products that we have inside that sovereign cloud, has now opened up that path where many of those that have historically only been on premises now looking at moving to the cloud. But let's be realistic, it's still very much a journey to get there, right? It's a hybrid configuration where you ease in with a certain set of workloads. We oftentimes see the productivity workloads lead in. But now we're seeing a whole lot more interest in, for example, a number of workloads that would be more Azure and infrastructure and platform as a service capabilities that also extend for ITAR compliance and higher levels of CMMC, so getting HPC workloads, et cetera. This gives, though, an opportunity for small and medium-sized companies to reinvent themselves over what you would have as a legacy architecture at a large company that can't just lift and shift their entire organization, right?
Yeah. What we see on the small medium side is really a difference depending on what infrastructure they're moving into. Are they moving into infrastructure as a service or PaaS? If that's the way they're going, especially with infrastructure as a service, we see typically less challenges migrating if they're picking up, an on-prem line of business system and putting it into, say, an Azure, right? We see less challenges there because, yes, there's some training differences in setup and configuration, that kind of thing. But once it's running, it's mostly the same as managing an on-prem infrastructure, right? But when you're moving into a SaaS infrastructure, that's a whole different deal. That's a big change for a lot of small medium businesses when they're looking at, okay, previously I just kind of had Exchange and some file shares, right? Mm-hmm. And now I'm moving that Exchange environment into Office 365. Mm-hmm. I'm moving those file shares and splitting them between OneDrive and SharePoint, and now I've got this thing called Teams, and I've got all these different tool sets that I didn't have before, and it's all integrated. And managing that kind of infrastructure is way different than managing kind of the on-prem Exchange organization, right? And so we see a lot of training training challenges around that. Mm-hmm. We see some user challenges around that as well. Now, most users pick it up pretty quickly, but when you're moving from an infrastructure, most companies are coming from what I would call a non-compliant on-prem infrastructure to moving into a compliant cloud-based infrastructure. They're not just getting hit with the differences of moving from on-prem to cloud. And many times, the biggest challenge that they have is moving from a non-compliant configuration to a compliant configuration, because now, their mobile device may act a little bit different because it's been locked down, or, their desktop may act different, or now I can't, maybe I can't use that USB thumb drive to move pictures around from my vacation, very easily because I've locked down, the USB thumb drives, plugging into the laptops. It's that kind of thing that we see a lot of, challenges for companies moving into those cloud. And it's not really so much a cloud move challenge as it is a compliance or a security challenge, right? Yep. But they're having to deal with it, and they conflate the two together because, I could do this when I was on-prem, and now I'm in the cloud, and I can't do this anymore, and that's a problem.
Yeah, anytime, an organization is transitioning technology like that, right, you've got, application issues, you've got culture issues, you've got process issues. You're talking about doing all three of those at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think especially the small to medium companies need to really think about the transition planning on it. A lot of people think, we're moving to cloud. It's a push of a button. We're just going to do that. But there's a lot of stuff in there, right? And it's just like any other system transition, right? Mm-hmm. You're doing, it reminds me of the plate spinning guys on the Lawrence Welk show. You have 100 different plates spinning at the same time to make this happen. And, my advice to them is to treat it like any other project. There's a plan, there's resources, there's a schedule, there's a transitionary period. You should have a pilot period. And it's probably going to take more effort than you think to get it right, and make sure you budget appropriate time and resources for it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things that we run into a lot, especially with small medium businesses, is one of the person on our team came up with this analogy of when you're building these infrastructures, you can't expect the person that is drawing the plans for the house to also be able to decorate the house, right? And it's kind of the same thing. Is you can't expect the person that is designing the infrastructure to also be able to plumb it, to be able to cut the grass and all these things. The ongoing process, of supporting the infrastructure is very different than the process that it was to build it. And the migration is something completely different. So you've got lots of different skill sets involved in these kinds of migrations, and you really have to take that into consideration when you're looking at making these kind of changes. And it's not making the kind of change of moving from on-prem to cloud, it's making these kind of changes of moving from on-prem to cloud while also moving from an insecure infrastructure to a secure infrastructure. Yeah. And you've got both of those challenges, like you said, going on at the same time, and making sure that you've got the right people in the right seats, the right partners that you're dealing with to make all that happen. So I think that's those are some of the things that we see as we're helping companies move.
Yeah, it's really a transformation project more than anything else, right? And people think of it as a technology project, but if I were to say, what is it going to take to transform your operational model of the way you run your company? That's a bigger problem to solve and more complicated.
So to that point, that's a big change. That's a lot to take on for a company that's, they're trying to deliver something to the government as it is. They're fully involved in that, and maybe they don't have time to deal with this thing, and they want to, and they're dealing with a prime contractor or something like that said, okay, well, why don't you just log into our environment? And we don't even worry about your environment anymore. You just don't deal with your. So can a business leverage another business's cloud infrastructure or on-prem infrastructure to handle controlled unclassified information rather than having to build this out in their infrastructure? What can they do there?
Yeah, I think theoretically that's possible, but I think there's a lot of caveats in there too, right? One of them is does everyone have the authority to view the information? And the other one is can you validate that cloud infrastructure that you're sharing actually meets the requirements of CMMC, right? And so if it's Microsoft Azure and they present you with this beautiful, and I really loved what Richard said about, we're going to present people with detail about how we're meeting all these requirements. If that exists, that's great, because then we can depend on it being appropriate. With a prime or another company providing that, they could have all those things, so I don't want to discount it, but it's more difficult, right? So there's a lot of caveats in there, but I think it's potentially doable if they do in fact meet all the requirements and they can validate that. And so when we conduct an assessment, we can say, yes, they absolutely are, and they have the authority to view the information. The other caveat is unless the sub in that scenario is CMMC level 3 themselves, they can't download and take control of any of that CUI. It has to be view only, right? So, I think it's theoretically possible and it could be worked out, but there are a few caveats in there to be just really careful of.
So you mentioned the assessment process of that. So what type of assessments are going to be done? Because you kind of hinted a little bit that there may be a different kind of assessment for these enclave type approaches than a full up CMMC certification for your own infrastructure.
Well, so there's only a full-on CMMC assessment. So in order to achieve a maturity level, all controls and practices are in scope within that maturity level that's being desired. So if it's maturity level 1, I think there's 17 controls in there. All 17 are in scope for any assessment. Now, whether or not all of those things are actually being operated by the assessed company is another question. So if some of those controls are satisfied by a cloud-based solution, then assuming we can validate that, we would say these are inherited practices. So we validate that, yes, they are doing those things. But companies won't be able to leave those things out of scope just because they're participating in say, that scenario you described a minute ago, or they're using Microsoft or AWS. Those practices will still have to be validated. But if they are, it would be really easy to validate them if Richard gave us this great deliverable he talked about and be like, oh, wow, well, this is okay, check, these guys are good on this one, as opposed to going through a process of, looking at evidence and interviewing people and going through that process of validating an on-prem solution. So there aren't different types of CMMC assessments in that sense, but there is this notion of inheriting something from an MSP or from a Microsoft or another company. Now, what's going to happen, with the market is really interesting, because if we have 300,000 or 500,000 or whatever the number ends up being, there's going to be new players coming into the market, right? There's going to be, Microsoft and Amazon are doing a great job of positioning right now. But with that kind of volume, and especially if the other agencies get involved, and then the GMs and the Fords and the Walmarts, just like they did with the other models, come into play eventually. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I'm guessing that probably will. There's going to be new players in the market, and that's inevitable. And so the question is how do we validate those players, right? So we know that Microsoft and Amazon have solutions that can be validated. We know that now. But when ABC company comes in and says, hey, we're half the price, of Microsoft, come work with us. And then what concerns me is that a lot of these small companies are going to say, oh, yeah, that's great. They say that they're compliant and maybe won't be able to validate it. And there's got to be some guidelines somehow that says if you're going with a cloud service provider, here's what they have to provide you.
Sure.
And that hasn't been defined in the market yet. So anytime we have such a massive business opportunity, we're going to have companies that are trying to leverage it, and not every one of them is as proficient or competent as Richard's company is, and that's something we're going to have to keep an eagle eye out for.
Okay, all right, great. So, as an extension of that, you guys, Microsoft, has put a lot of thought into how you help companies manage, handle, process, protect controlled unclassified information. What infrastructures do you have? What cloud environments do you have? I know that you just wrote a blog on this, so I want to tee you up a little bit on it. So how have you built your infrastructure to be able to handle controlled unclassified information for the DIP?
Yes. I go back to the very first cloud that I was involved with, that was a unique enclave that we built for the U.S. government with GCC. This is back, 8 years ago. In the journey that we've gone through over the course of the last decade to meet the requirements for U.S. government, for the Department of Defense, et cetera. And it's become, a progressive level of cloud offerings that we've been able to meet those unique requirements, such as if you look at getting full coverage for the export controls that you have with the ITAR and with EAR, that it required us to build and invest in a sovereign architecture, right, that's both physically and virtually isolated. And you'll know that with the branding that we have for Azure Government as well as Microsoft 365 Government GCC High. With those cloud offerings, we're able to achieve a high watermark for compliance. It's required not only for the Department of Defense themselves and the DoD environment, but also for the defense industrial base. But I will say that if I had a quarter, for every time that I've had somebody ask me, how we can say that we've got, for example, a maybe for controlled unclassified information in clouds other than GCC High and Azure Government, we've gone through this debate of looking at, the requirements for controlled unclassified information, how they may align with, for example, our GCC, what we kind of refer to as our moderate environment versus commercial. And, many organizations, especially the multinationals, that they're naturally going to have a set of compliance requirements and data sovereignty requirements that may have them even straddle between multiple different clouds, and what I'll refer to as like a swivel seat. But at the end of the day, there's a debate, I would say, in terms of looking at controlled unclassified information, of the level of the high watermark that you would need to be able to say that I do protect controlled unclassified information, because there's over 24 different categories of CUI that NARA has a catalog of which include controlled unclassified information category for export controlled data. So oftentimes I'll work with companies that say we don't really work with ITAR. So we wouldn't necessarily need a sovereign cloud, because the requirements for ITAR are, while that's part of CUI, wouldn't require us to do data handling on a regular basis. So we may be able to pull off and have a level of coverage of the other categories, privacy, et cetera, for CUI in a different cloud, in commercial or within GCC, et cetera. But the gist of my article is to say that if you look at the standards, not only if you look at CMMC level 3, if you look at the DISA SRG security requirements guideline, et cetera, that the definition of controlled unclassified information does extend to export controlled data. So the argument is, and what Microsoft's recommendation is, if you have controlled unclassified information that you need to protect, that we can only have a contractual obligation to that within our U.S. sovereign cloud, which is Azure Government and GCC High, where we do have a contractual obligation to ITAR.
Okay. And so it doesn't matter if it's ITAR or basic CUI rather than specified, which is could be export controlled. That all of that content really, from a Microsoft standpoint, needs to be in GCC High. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and that also I would say apply to organizations as they're evaluating their own risk profile, their posture towards securing data, because oftentimes they have controlled unclassified information that they haven't been able to locate or to properly mark, right? And if you haven't yet hit that level of maturity that you need for being able to have separate data handling controls for basic versus, for example, ITAR and export control, then you may look at having a higher watermark in which case that would elevate you into our U.S. sovereign cloud.
And speaking from a large prime standpoint, they, like you said, they straddle clouds, right? Multinationals, they may have portion of their infrastructure in, say, the German cloud, cloud. They may have portion of their infrastructure in the U.S. commercial cloud. They may have a portion of their infrastructure in the GCC high cloud, right? But they have the size and the complexity and the resources to be able to manage all of those and do it properly, right? Mm-hmm. What we see from a small business standpoint is when a small business tries to go in on a cloud environment, they pretty much have to go all in somewhere. They don't have the size, the maturity, the people necessary to manage multiple clouds in an appropriate manner to be able to say, okay, well, all of our CUI is going to be in GCC High and our non-CUI content is going to be in commercial. That just doesn't work for most smaller businesses simply because of the complexity and the training requirements and everything else of getting people to be able to do that appropriately.
Yeah. And quite often, there is a transition for many companies that began in a commercial side environment and recognize that they need to migrate into a sovereign cloud, to an IL4 authorized cloud, etc. So there is, naturally a progression to migrate from one to the other where you may straddle. Some do decide to stay with a footprint in commercial for financial reasons, right? Because there is an additional cost that's associated with moving to the cloud, whether it's migration costs or even looking at additional costs for SKUs. I mean, we do have higher costs of goods sold in the U.S. sovereign cloud, so you'll see a bit of uptick in the cost for that. That said, those that typically try to save money by not going all into the cloud to the cloud end up costing more over the course of time.
Sure.
Because if you're straddling, it's what I call like a swivel seat scenario. If you're straddling between commercial and government, oftentimes you would identify that people that you have homed in the commercial side also need access to the government side.
Right.
You end up paying for 2 licenses, right? So you end up with multiple desktops, whether one's virtual or not. You end up with multiple user accounts with added complexity. Right. It can become more expensive than just to go and shift 100% into one environment, right?
Right. And we kind of see the same thing, not just with what you've been talking about is within the Microsoft ecosystem, but we see kind of the same thing when you're talking about multiple vendors, right? Mm-hmm. We have numerous clients that they straddle Amazon and Microsoft, right? Sure. They've got portion of their infrastructure. Maybe their IaaS is in Amazon's GovCloud, and their SaaS is in Office 365 GCC High. And what are the benefits and the pros and cons of that kind of infrastructure from your perspective?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics. If you look at the investments that Microsoft made, we identified as a company, even as an enterprise going back a half decade ago, that to be able to provide a holistic solution, we had gaps in our coverage for security and products that would align with coverage, and going out and looking at all the different third-party products that we had to stitch together and integrate in order to have a holistic solution. So we've made all these investments into, I would say, 2 areas that are of significance is being able to extend our cloud solutions into hybrid configurations, so being able to support your legacy investments that you have in your on-premises data center, even if those are traditional Microsoft technology, Windows Server, et cetera, that could be even running in other cloud vendors, to be able to provide a hybrid strategy across our cloud, but also looking at the security suite of products that we now have, from a SIEM with Sentinel to virtual desktop with Windows Virtual Desktop, to having a CASB solution, to having endpoint protection with Intune and with Defender ATP. And all these not only help and have a great integration story into our own platform, but they also do extend across that boundary. And we can pull them all up together. You'll see the investments we've made into things like the Compliance Manager and Azure Security Center. So now you have a dashboard. You can go in and configure that dashboard for NIST 800-171 today. We're also working on the investments for having CMMC templates that you can import into the Compliance Manager and Azure Security Center. so that you can have a single dashboard with a real-time view of the compliance of your organization, not only tightly integrated into our platform, but also extending out into where you've got coverage from the endpoint and to workloads that are running in other enclaves such as on-prem.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's a great story there from an integration standpoint of these different products, right? Like you mentioned, Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. You've got Sentinel. You've got all the different capabilities that you can pull together from a Microsoft standpoint. But there's still an argument to be made, I think, and I want to hear your take on this. There's an argument to be made that diversity of infrastructure, diversity of vendor selection, if you will, also provides a level of inoculation, right? Because maybe inoculation is a little bit too strong of a word, but it allows you to say, well, if Microsoft has a bug in this specific stack, but I have another stack, maybe only half of my infrastructure, or maybe only my SaaS infrastructure is going to get compromised potentially, and maybe not my my infrastructure in this other environment. What would you say to that kind of question?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at many of the organizations we work with, they already have significant investments in the third-party security products. We recognize that. Even if you decide that you would look at moving and shifting to a Microsoft first strategy for certain capabilities, maybe a SIEM solution with Sentinel, there's still a transition to move from one to the other. Historically, I'd say many organizations have made their technology decisions based on more of a best-of-breed scenario. Challenge with the best-of-breed, of course, is not having that native integration. But we also recognize that we need to be able to integrate in with our partners, right? So a lot of the security products, for example, we have tight partnerships with at Microsoft, many of which even run some of their services within our cloud, but we are able to work with them so that they can host their products and solutions and integrate back into Microsoft. So it's, Microsoft has a tight integration story with our products, but we also are working with what has historically probably been more co-opetition, if you will, that enable us to accommodate more scenarios.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen, over the last 6 to 9 months is, or really even a little bit longer than that, is the how Microsoft has begun to embrace the Linux infrastructure and bring that in. I have a number of customers that are heavy into modeling and simulation. Right, and they use a lot of Linux infrastructure as part of that modeling and simulation, capability. And so their users don't sit on Windows desktops all day; they sit on Linux workstations, and that's where they do their day-to-day work. And so one of the things that I've been, really encouraged by is, Microsoft has released the Teams client now for Linux. Right, that is really encouraging that Microsoft has done that. Seeing the need for other desktop, other OSs, and kind of that diversity of platform capabilities, is Microsoft looking at doing that, for more of the Office stack? Outlook would be, that would be like almost a holy grail for some of these, guys that sit on Linux desktops, have Outlook on their Linux machine.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a story around not only extending our capabilities to multiple different platforms. If you look at many of the investments we've made, of course, into Android, we just released the Surface Duo with the whole Office suite running now on a mobile device, in a first-party device as well. We're able to extend, and you'll find, for example, Defender Advanced Threat Protection now is extended out beyond just Windows to protect Macintosh and others, that our story has improved. And then for those gaps in strategy or coverage, we also will offer and have now the Windows Virtual Desktop that you can extend down into those other clients as well.
Yeah, that's really encouraging, because there are a lot of companies that don't have just complete Microsoft, infrastructure. Sure. They need that capability, and switching gears a little bit, Jeff. One of the questions that I get on a consistent basis is, what's going on with this Defar's rule rewrite?
Right.
We know that DoD has said that they're going to be rewriting the Defar's rule, the 7012 rule. I think the expectation is that the 7012 rule is going to stay in place, but there's going to be a new rule that's going to be, I don't know, 20 or something like that. So what's that process looking like right now from an AB standpoint?
Sure.
How have you guys been involved, and what can we expect with that?
Sure. So I can't address all of those issues,
Okay.
but I can tell you that there is a process underway that we're hoping will be underway soon, and we'll learn more about soon. And we have been providing information as requested by the DoD about things like how assessments are going to work and how adjudication is going to work, and those types of sort of very high-profile issues. And there also is a movement. We're trying to move towards doing some pilot assessments and doing some, getting some at least some level 1 assessments out on the market soon. But the DoD has made it clear that rulemaking could change the outcome of some of those things. So if rulemaking changes, for instance, scoping types of questions, questions related to the interpretation of practices or the way evidence is viewed or collected, then anyone that's had an assessment may have to go back and have a delta on some of the things that may have changed. So I can't really share the specifics of what's going on there, but I understand that it's underway now, and they have the information that they've asked us to provide. They have that, and we're hoping that once it's resolved, we'll be able to start seeing CMMC as part of RFPs and RFIs. But until it's been resolved, we're not going to see that. That's the way I understand it. So it's happening, above my pay grade, which is actually really simple because we're volunteers. But we are looking forward to that coming out, and we know it's an ongoing process right now.
Okay, great. Thanks for the insight there. I know that's something that everybody is really paying attention to because, CMMC is one thing, but when Defar's rules start changing, stuff hits the fan pretty hard.
I totally agree, and we're all anxious to see the result of that. And I don't know when the public comment period starts. There's all kinds of rumors out there, but soon. And as far as when it will wrap up, I don't have insight into that.
Okay. Yeah. So kind of along the same lines from an assessment standpoint, are there going to be appendices, additional assessment guides released? And you mentioned a little bit about it earlier, specifically for cloud-centric businesses. How's the CMMCAB going to help assessors, approach these cloud-centric businesses?
Sure. So the purpose of an assessment guide is to provide guidance to the OSC as to the meaning of the practices and how they might demonstrate compliance with them, right? And so that's obviously contextual. So in any kind of assessment process, the practice, think of the practice as kind of like the what. So it's the what part of the model, like here's what you need to demonstrate. The assessment guide provides examples of the how you need to demonstrate it, so that OSCs and assessors, frankly, can look at it and say, okay, in this given environment, here's the kind of things we would typically see as examples or as physical manifestations of the practice in real life. So that's an ongoing process. So there's a couple of working groups together working on the assessment guide. The DoD is very involved with it. The AB has been working very hard. I think Reagan Eden's working groups talks about thousands of hours spent on it. It's quite substantial, and I know there's a consolidation going on with the DoD right now of what the meaning of it is, and that cloud service providers are on the radar for at some point to have content in there. But I don't think right now that content has been developed.
Okay. All right. So do you think that they're going to be, I mentioned a little bit about specific CMMC practices. Do you see the model maturing, evolving over a period of time to include additional practices, or do we not know yet?
Yeah, so the model has already evolved. Mm-hmm. So, it's evolved. I think there's been 2 new releases since January, and I may be wrong on 2. It may be 1.
1.02 is the current version.
So they've made revisions already. The partnership of organizations that work on that is quite large. There's quite a few partners. So I would expect, especially when rulemaking occurs, that we may see changes to the model. I don't know for sure that that's going to happen, but I would expect, based on the feedback we do from the provisional assessments and the feedback that are provided by the mock assessments, that we probably will see change requests for changes to the model, and that they will come out with them, if they make sense, fairly quickly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been curious about really since we started seeing the model take shape, the .4 came out, and it was enormous, right?
350.
Yeah, it was huge.
Or something like that. Yeah.
And then, then we had .6 and .7, and it continued to skinny down until we got to the 1.0.
Yeah.
I've been wondering, are we going to see some of those, things that got cut out show back up? Things like asset management, for example. I mean, the asset management, domain was just gutted when you moved from the .4 to the .6.
Yeah.
Are we going to see some of those kind of things come back in?
Yeah, the AB doesn't. The model is controlled by the DoD. They own the standard, so that's going to be up to them how they change things.
Okay.
I know that there's significant discussions going on about the size of the model and how difficult it may or may not be to achieve level 3, and the feedback from the provisional and the mock assessments are probably going to drive a lot of those discussions. So I would expect that there'll be at least discussions about, going one way or the other, and that the DoD is free to do that, and they own the model. I don't have any specific information about what they may put in or not put in at this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. It's been great information. Richard, I want to finish this off today on kind of some newsy kind of stuff, if you have the information. But what's happening within the Microsoft Cloud? What's being released? Kind of what kind of roadmap information can you give us?
Yeah. Well, pertinent to the previous discussion, if you look at from a compliance posture perspective, we built various different enclaves. So we've got the U.S. Sovereign Cloud, as I've mentioned, with Azure Government and GCC High. We've got GCC and additional clouds that I can refer to that all have requirements and responsibilities to things like the Defar. So when we do get an updated Defar in the coming months, we do have an obligation. We'll work on making sure that we meet our end of those obligations within our government clouds. Right, and that include, if you look at CMMC, we've had the investments into making sure that we can establish that program of reciprocity. So look for, in the coming months, us releasing documentation as we go through this provisional period with the assessments to understand, how our cloud environment will be judged, and making sure that we provide the right level of documentation. So you'll see releases of that coming from Microsoft. Taking it up a level, though, the one thing that I'd like to hit on is the fact that Microsoft's commitment to the U.S. government and the Department of Defense is significant, and we've got multiple sovereign clouds now that extend not just from Azure Government, but we also now have, and that's for unclassified workloads. We now have Azure Government Secret, which is part of our classified offering for DoD Impact Level 6 environments, or the intelligence community with ICD 503, now give us an option to also meet some of those requirements for an air-gapped environment, as well as a top secret cloud that we'll be bringing to life next year. And all of these come with a commitment to get to parity with commercial. So we are racing towards one of the largest initiatives within the history of our company to literally engage with the 120 plus product groups there that are developing services across Microsoft to make sure that we're able to deliver all these capabilities into the U.S. sovereign clouds. In addition to looking at that commitment to parity, you'll see that we're already releasing a lot of the capabilities that have been really pertinent to the defense industrial base. I mentioned we have Azure Sentinel coming into GCC High earlier this year, to Azure Government earlier this year. We have Windows Virtual Desktop coming online. We've got GPU SKUs that have come online within Azure Government regions for HPC workloads. And getting towards that parity is a mission for us. Looking at the compliance angle for alignment with, for example, what we see coming from the CMMC accreditation body are things around like FedRAMP high requirements. We also have the DoD for security requirements guideline for an IL4. So by way of example, if you look at almost all the services that we have in Azure Government already at an IL4, we're racing even towards and have most of the services already at an IL5 within Azure Government. So that's another major investment. The other thing we've heard loud and clear especially from the Tier 1 contractors that have been working with their subcontractors to get compliant by going into our sovereign clouds, is addressing the requirements for eligibility. Eligibility has had a fairly high barrier to entry to date because you have to go get a sponsorship letter from a government agency, and if your tier's down, that can be less than trivial. So we've been working with the U.S. government to come up with and be able to establish a more streamlined approach to eligibility that you'll see us release next month. So it will actually make it much easier for companies within the defense industrial base to prove their eligibility to get into our government clouds.
Okay. So, is there any information you can give us, kind of a preview of what that's going to look like, what's going to be required?
It's strictly under NDA today,
Okay.
but it's coming in just a few weeks, so you'll see it available.
All right.
Yep.
Good. That's all the questions I had, unless there's something that you guys wanted to bring up. Is there anything else that you guys would like to talk about before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I appreciate you having us out. And, great to meet Richard and you, and I really enjoyed the time with you.
Absolutely, and thank you guys so much for coming down and letting us put this together. I think it went really well. I'm really excited about being able to bring this kind of information to the DIB community, and so that they can get the answers that they're asking. These are all questions that we get on a regular basis. So